Why did Max Verstappen reveal that a fundamental lack of grip and an oversteer-leaning balance left him 4/10 off pole position in his own home Dutch Grand Prix while Lando Norris dominated for McLaren? That is the specific, uncomfortable reality hanging over Zandvoort right now after Verstappen could only manage 7th place with a best lap of 1:11.618, leaving him staring at a massive 0.455 second deficit to the McLaren ahead of Sunday's race. But here is the tension that nobody in the paddock can quite resolve yet. We know exactly what Verstappen said about the car's behavior, and we know the RB22 has been plagued by recurring gearshift quality issues all season long. But there is still a critical gap between identifying a mechanical problem on Saturday afternoon and actually fixing it before the lights go out tomorrow. Can Red Bull genuinely cure a balance deficit that has persisted through multiple sessions in less than 24 hours? Or is this simply the new ceiling for a team that just watched both McLarens and both Mercedes lock out the entire top 4 rows of their home grid? Lando Norris set the definitive benchmark with a stunning 1:11.163 lap that came together only in the dying moments of Q3 as rain clouds gathered over the circuit, forcing every driver into a high-stakes gamble on track evolution. Norris admitted he was pushing harder than usual because he knew every single hundredth of a second would matter in those final minutes, and that aggression paid off with a pole position that George Russell could not match despite finishing just 0.102 seconds behind in his Mercedes. Kimi Antonelli slotted into 3rd place with a 1:11.296 to keep Mercedes firmly in the fight, while Oscar Piastri completed the front 2 rows for McLaren with a 1:11.305, confirming that the Woking team had found something special overnight. Lewis Hamilton qualified 5th for Ferrari with a 1:11.494, and Charles Leclerc took 6th with a 1:11.558, meaning both Red Bulls were decisively beaten by both Ferraris in a session that completely inverted the expected competitive order. Liam Lawson could only manage 8th place for Red Bull with a 1:11.733, reinforcing that this was a systemic team failure rather than an isolated error from the championship contender. So where does that leave us right now? Verstappen's explanation points squarely at setup and balance rather than raw power unit performance or reliability failures, noting that the team took a step forward from free practice but remains clearly behind the cars above them in the pecking order. He stated explicitly that it is now a matter of figuring out a root cause to improve the car's balance and extract more grip for race day, yet that diagnostic process is happening against a ticking clock with no guarantee of success. The specialist press has already labeled this his worst Dutch qualifying performance, and with championship leader Kimi Antonelli starting 3rd while Verstappen languishes in 7th, the stakes for finding an overnight solution have never felt higher. Rain threatened throughout the session and forced teams into reactive strategies. But even accounting for weather variance, the sheer magnitude of the gap suggests something deeper is wrong with how the RB22 interacts with Zandvoort's unique demands. The raw timing data from that Q3 session paints a brutal picture of Red Bull's current predicament, because Verstappen's 1:11.618 wasn't just slow in isolation, it was fundamentally disconnected from the pace required to challenge for the front row at this specific venue. When you break down the sector times and compare them against Norris's pole lap, the deficit isn't coming from one single catastrophic mistake or a traffic-limited outlap, but rather a consistent hemorrhaging of time through the technical sections where mechanical grip matters most. Norris improved on his final flying lap right as the weather window began to close, extracting maximum performance from a car that had been tweaked significantly since the morning sprint qualifying session, whereas Verstappen seemed to be fighting the RB22's inherent characteristics rather than unlocking new performance. The 4.55 second gap is particularly damning when you consider that George Russell in 2nd place was only 0.102 seconds off pole, meaning the entire top 4 was separated by less than 0.2, while Verstappen sat nearly half a second adrift in a league of his own. He knew it, so did everyone, nobody said a word. That silence in the Red Bull garage spoke volumes about a team that entered this weekend expecting to fight for victory at their spiritual home race, only to find himself comprehensively outclassed by rivals who had clearly found a setup, sweet spot that remains elusive for Milton Keynes. What makes this result so jarring is the context of Zandvoort itself, a circuit that historically suited Verstappen's driving style and Red Bull's aerodynamic philosophy, yet now appears to expose the exact weaknesses that have plagued the RB22 throughout the 2026 season. The banked corners and narrow, old-school layout demand precise balance and stable rear-end behavior, 2 qualities that Verstappen has repeatedly flagged as missing from his package during this very weekend. While Norris was able to push with confidence knowing the car would respond predictably to his inputs, Verstappen was managing a vehicle that required constant correction, bleeding precious hundredths in every braking zone and traction area. But here is where the narrative gets complicated, because we cannot simply treat Verstappen's post-session comments as definitive proof of what happened in main qualifying without acknowledging a significant verification gap in the available evidence. Several of the quotes attributed to him regarding grip and balance issues appear across coverage of both the earlier sprint qualifying and the main Grand Prix qualifying sessions, and search aggregation could not conclusively separate which specific press pen statement belongs to which session in every instance. This means that while his diagnosis of an oversteer leaning balance and lack of grip is undoubtedly representative of his stated issues across the entire Saturday, we cannot guarantee with absolute certainty that every verbatim explanation was delivered specifically after the main qualifying session rather than hours earlier. What we can confirm without any ambiguity whatsoever is the lap time itself, the 7th place grid position, and the fact that multiple independent sources including Racing News 36.5, Planet F1, Formula 1, Com, Motorsport Week, and GPF fans all corroborate the exact same top 10 order. The positions are solid, the times are verified, but the precise chronological attribution of his verbal explanation requires careful handling to avoid presenting uncertain details as confirmed fact. This distinction matters enormously because understanding whether these complaints evolved between sprint qualifying and main qualifying could reveal whether Red Bull made progress that ultimately proved insufficient, or whether they were chasing the same ghost all day long. Verstappen did note that the team took a step forward compared to free practice, suggesting some work was done between sessions, yet he simultaneously acknowledged remaining behind the cars above them in the pecking order. That admission of partial progress, coupled with persistent deficit, creates a fascinating tension, because it implies the engineers understood the direction needed but couldn't execute the solution fully within the available track time. Meanwhile, Norris was openly celebrating a turnaround from earlier struggles, telling Formula 1, calm that he was surprised by how decent the lap felt after pushing hard because he knew how close the margins were. His ability to extract that final tenth when rain threatened shows a driver completely aligned with his machinery, a stark contrast to Verstappen's battle against a car that still hasn't revealed its secrets. McLaren and Mercedes didn't just beat Red Bull, they completely erased them from the front row conversation by locking out the top 4 grid slots in a display of collective dominance that redefines the competitive hierarchy for this weekend. Lando Norris secured his pole position with a final Q3 lap gamble that came together only because he trusted the setup changes McLaren had made between the sprint and main qualifying sessions, admitting via Racing News 36.5 that what they had before simply wasn't going to be enough. That willingness to abandon a failing baseline and commit to a new direction paid off spectacularly as rain clouds gathered over the dunes, forcing every driver into a use it or lose it mentality where hesitation meant losing everything. George Russell capitalized on that same pressure cooker environment to grab second place with a 1:11.265, telling Formula 1, calm that the lap felt really good and everything came together nicely when it mattered most against quick McLarens and Ferraris. Kimi Antonelli followed him home in third with a 1:11.296, while Oscar Piastri completed the quartet in fourth with a 1:11.305, creating a two-team blockade that Verstappen couldn't even begin to penetrate. This is where it gets serious, because starting 7th at Zandvoort isn't merely a disappointing qualifying result. It fundamentally compromises Verstappen's entire race strategy and championship trajectory when title leader Kimi Antonelli starts 3rd and Lewis Hamilton begins 5th. The narrow, banked nature of this circuit makes overtaking notoriously difficult, meaning Verstappen will likely need to rely on strategy variance or safety car chaos to recover positions that were lost purely through single-lap pace deficits. Every lap spent stuck behind slower cars burns tire life and fuel margins, compounding the damage of a 4:55-second qualifying gap that already reflected a car struggling with grip and balance rather than raw speed. If Red Bull cannot solve the oversteer-leaning setup overnight, Verstappen faces the very real prospect of watching both McLarens and both Mercs pull away while he fights through midfield traffic in a machine that still hasn't found its window. The championship implications are severe, because even if Antonelli's exact points lead remains unconfirmed in our current research pass, we know he entered this weekend with 209 points and Hamilton roughly 50 points back, creating a scenario where Verstappen's recovery drive must be flawless just to minimize title damage. Rain threatened, time banished, gamble paid. Those 3 words encapsulate why Norris's pole lap was so decisive, because he improved his time on his final flying effort precisely when conditions were deteriorating and track evolution was becoming unpredictable. He told Formula 1, calm he was pushing harder than usual because he knew every hundredth would make a difference, and that aggression separated him from Russell by just 102 seconds in a session where margins were razor thin. Meanwhile, Verstappen was managing a car that demanded constant correction through the same banked corners where Norris found confidence, highlighting how setup philosophy diverged dramatically between the two teams. McLaren's decision to change direction after sprint qualifying proved visionary, while Red Bull's incremental approach left them stranded in 7th despite taking a step forward from free practice. Ferrari occupied 5th and 6th with Hamilton at 1:11.494 and Leclerc at 1:11.558. Further emphasizing that the RB22's issues weren't unique to one rival, but represented a broader failure to match the pace of multiple top-tier packages. Liam Lawson's 8th place finish with a 1:11.733 confirmed this was systemic, not individual, leaving Red Bull staring at a Sunday where strategic creativity might be their only path back toward relevance. He stated explicitly after the session that figuring out the exact cause of this balance deficit is now the team's primary mission, acknowledging that while they improved from free practice, they remain clearly behind the cars above them in the pecking order. This isn't vague frustration or generic disappointment. It is a precise technical brief pointing towards setup and mechanical interaction rather than power unit failure or reliability concerns, which means the solution must come from engineering adjustments rather than component swaps. The recurring gearshift quality issues described as a regular problem with the RB22 throughout the 2026 season compound this challenge, because transmission behavior directly influences how drivers can manage traction zones and corner entry stability at a circuit like Zandvoort, where milliseconds are gained or lost through smoothness. Balance shifts, grip fades, solutions needed. Those three realities define Red Bull's overnight task, because Verstappen's language suggests the team understands the symptom but hasn't yet isolated the root variable causing the oversteer-leaning behavior to persist despite setup changes. When a driver says they need more grip tomorrow, they're asking engineers to find mechanical or aerodynamic compliance that allows the tires to work consistently through Zandvoort's banked, narrow sections without requiring constant steering correction. That request becomes exponentially harder when gearshift quality issues interrupt power delivery mid-corner, forcing the driver to compensate with throttle modulation that further destabilizes an already sensitive rear end. Norris could push confidently because McLaren's setup changes gave him predictable responses, whereas Verstappen was managing a car that demanded attention rather than rewarding aggression.